The beginning of the D&D player's journey is best described with two words: exciting and intimidating. Exciting because everything they do is their first time doing that thing. There are so many classes to try, quests to complete, and stories to tell. All the best adventures are still ahead of them, but it's intimidating because there is just so much unknown. The rules are complicated and new. The idea of role-playing in character may feel cringe or awkward, and the game plays very differently from any board, card, or video game. New players are some of the most fun to play with because they haven't been influenced yet by rule structure and optimization, making them naturally more curious and open to trying new things. An old player introducing a new player to the game is like hanging out with your kid. You may have seen everything, but watching this new guy get impressed by what you see as mundane brings a sort of freshness and enthusiasm to the table that can't really be matched. But a lack of rules knowledge and basic player etiquette will be this player's biggest problem, which ties into stage 2. The player's aware of the basics of the gameplay loop, that being the combat, roleplay, and simple skill challenges that they've experienced over their last few games, completing one-shots, two-shots, and short campaigns. The new player's interest and enjoyment of the game increases as they grow more competent and less insecure. This translates into confidence and comfort when playing, turning a game that they already enjoyed into a much more fun and immersive experience. This is one of the best times to be a D&D player, as you're learning the most information at the fastest rate you ever will, and there is still so much uncharted territory to explore. Now, they can truly call themselves a regular D&D player. With enough knowledge to start understanding the memes and discussion around the game, they have all the marks of a fresh D&D player. Unfortunately, this confidence can become their downfall later, but first, the next stage, which is discovering their play style. At this point, the player has an educated understanding of exactly what they enjoy out of the game, so they spend their time refining that. I've seen players walk in expecting a fantasy combat simulator or survival adventure game, but they really warmed up to roleplay over time after having experienced it. I've also seen the opposite, theater kids just looking for an acting outlet turning into bloodthirsty war criminals. If they are big combat fans, they'll watch YouTube videos about min-maxing and getting the best battle build. If roleplay is more their flavor, they will find inspiration for their next character in any piece of media they consume. The point is that by now they understand what combination of things they find the most fun and engage best with that. But the next stage is where the good can turn ugly. The player now has all the knowledge of what they can do, with none of the experience that comes from failure, as they likely haven't seen any major consequences for their actions at this point. So they test their boundaries and see what they are really capable of. Think of this as that one part of a video game where you jump off a cliff to see if you take fall damage, or shoot teammates to test if there's friendly fire. Take those examples, but apply them to the scale of a tabletop role-playing game. So their margin for error is as big as the entire creative scope of Dungeons & Dragons. The sheer size and flavor of the problems they cause will depend on what brand of player they are. If they're a more comedic role player, interactions with NPCs could go way too far. If they're more into combat, their recklessness will be costly. But the biggest and most dangerous threat is the Dungeon Master's niceness. Being a nice DM has a lot of advantages. It genuinely outweighs the downsides. But the one big drawback they usually suffer from is managing unruly players. The DM being too nice is an enabler of many D&D horror stories, and simply put, they will struggle with unruly players and saying no. Usually it's a bad mix of good intentions. The player has not suffered a major loss yet, so they are testing themselves. The nice DM just wants a fun game, so they may unintentionally give the green light to bad behavior just by trying to be nice. I remember I was a much nicer DM when I was new, so when my players would start testing risky behavior, I would downplay the danger level to keep the game fun and casual, which was stupid because it enabled them to do more risky behavior, which required more layers of bogus plot armor. The problem can be completely avoided by a skilled DM and player, but what happens next is a sobering moment for everyone who experiences it. Due to either recklessness or just bad luck, the player experiences their first unexpected and unwanted character death. You notice one big thing right off the bat, and that is that character death hits harder than you'd think it would. All the time I get posts from players who were completely caught off guard by how surprisingly painful character death is. And when you think about it, there's a good reason for that. Players put a lot of themselves into their characters, and the more into roleplay you are, the harder you're going to take the loss of an entire character, from their story, friends, personality, and role in the group. This is especially true for people who have a deep connection to their character, because for them, when their character dies, an extension of themselves that they constructed and lived through dies too. But even for players that don't focus on roleplay, you will probably have to learn a new class, get new loot, and rework your combat style. There is no guarantee that you will enjoy this as much or more than your last one, so it's understandably scary. Plus, death just sucks. If you haven't had a character die on you, think about your favorite fictional character dying. Now imagine that you created him and your choices could have prevented it. There's a world of difference between knowing something would kill you and actually going through it. While this stage has been very death-centered, dying is not the only way players can have this sort of wake-up call. It can be any scenario where they face serious consequences for a serious mistake, and they finally understand from experience that their actions can have adverse consequences. Some examples of this can be getting brought to the brink of death, a favorite NPC dying, or failing a quest in a way that seriously affects them. But I use death as it's the strongest example, and it's something that most players experience if they play for long enough anyways. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel. After the dust of despair settles, all the player is left with is perspective. Enlightenment slowly accumulates throughout the player's experience, but it skyrockets after things go terribly wrong. Why? Scarcity. Knowing that something doesn't last forever, or that it's actively running out, makes people value it more while they have it. So when the chips are down, the very real chance of losing gets the player into a do-or-die mindset. On top of that, experience with failure gives the player more appreciation for every win. Enlightenment is the moment the player finally, truly understands the player experience inside and out, from the peaks of success to the valleys of failure. Equipped with experience, they're ready to set off on their next stage. This one is less of a stage and more of a process. This player can teach the game to people that will become the same beginners from the start of this video, who will look up to this paragon of information and politely, yet firmly, force them to DM. Noobs will look on in amazement as our hero correctly identifies all the different dice, knows all the classes by heart, and has a wealth of fun stories to share. But while beginners look to this player as their guide, our player knows the limits of his knowledge and perhaps doesn't feel he knows that much at all. This stage is defined by a long stretch of time, after they understand the game, but as they experience it from a non-beginner's point of view. As such, people can spend years in this stage. As they make their way through the game, they develop opinions, they can approach discussion of the game from an educated point of view, and are typically the ones getting involved in the never-ending wars of online discourse. At this point, the player may even take on the helm as a dungeon master, running their own games. Taking it a step further, they can dabble in writing homebrew, world building, and tweaking the game ever so subtly. As they gain experience, two things happen, one good, the other bad. Both of these effects will become more extreme the longer they play, and will set the tone for the next stage. The good news is that the more they play, the better they understand the game. Everybody's experienced having to stop the game and pull out the rules. It sucks, but from the beginning of this stage to the end, the player will become more adept. Rules knowledge becomes second nature, so the game runs faster and smoother with less hiccups. The big drawback is that very same knowledge will make our player all too aware of the flaws with Dungeons & Dragons as a system. What the player perceives as a flaw can vary. Some people love the things that others can't stand, and some people see very little to no flaws at all. These things are very important to our next and final stage. After all is said and done, the end of their journey manifests in a few different ways. Whether they prefer combat, roleplay, or anything else, these are the endings of a D&D player. Let's start with the Lawful Evil ending. This player has seen the game for what it is and decided that it's not for them. They are fed up with D&D. There is just so much that they've grown to hate that they can barely stand it anymore. They may have tried homebrewing and patching rules they don't like, but not even that is enough. But if they've been playing this long, they like tabletop RPGs, they just want a new RPG to obsess over. This is one of those good news, bad news situations. Any game that is not D&D has opportunities to go in entirely new directions. While D&D has to paint with a broad fantasy brush, other RPGs can focus on perfecting more specific scenarios. Because of that, they can be designed extremely well and have the most die-hard fan bases. Luckily, they have found the perfect game. Now they just need to find a group willing to play it. This is the polar opposite of the Lawful Good ending. This player really sees very little, if any, problems with their edition of D&D. They enjoy it perfectly fine the way it is, and they are unlikely to homebrew anything. The way they see it, Wizards worked hard on these rules, and they work, so why change them? These types are most commonly found playing the official written campaigns and becoming experts of the system and the lore surrounding it. Their weakness is that they are sometimes known to hit you with the book and be more rules-heavy than accommodating. Lawful goods are the mortal enemies of the degenerate, chaotic evils. These are the mad professors of the D&D community. They will not play regular D&D, but they refuse to find a game that fits them better. They have gone mad and taken it upon themselves to hammer puzzle pieces together, cramming so much homebrew into D&D that an onlooker wouldn't even recognize it as the same game. They see the rules more like the pirate code, more guidelines than actual rules. On that note, when reading their homebrew, it's either going to be the best innovation in tabletop role-playing history or just abysmally bad. But whether or not they're the genius kind of crazy or the crazy kind of crazy, their big weakness is that they are playing something so specific and different from traditional D&D that they will never get to play in their own creation, as their chance of finding someone who designed their game similarly is very slim. It can also be hard for them to find players to go along with it, pushing them into the DM seat more often than not. So they are most commonly found as that wildcard dungeon master. This player casually enjoys most of what D&D has to offer, but as their tastes developed, they realized it could be 90% better if they just fine-tune a small portion of the game to fit them better. So they tweak D&D just enough to fit their needs. The best thing about the game, in their opinion, is that the rules exist, but they are so loose and disconnected that you can effectively switch out anything you like and still have a functioning game. These guys know what they're about, and essentially get the best of both worlds, getting the large player base of D&D while still being unique enough to cater to their specific group. This is the part where I should say what their big drawback is, but that comes down to how good of a game designer they are. Lastly, and most relatably to the casual D&D enjoyer, the neutral good ending, described with 2 words, just vibing. They just like playing D&D. They don't care how much or how little homebrew there is. They don't care what setting it is. They are just happy to be involved. They are the most likely to be forever players, rarely touching the DMing chair, but when they do, it's a good time, if a a little basic. They are the ultimate golden retriever player. To put it another way, they never really left stage 6. This was a difficult video to make as D&D is such a big concept that you can't accurately pin down every player's experience, but this was my best shot. Try to think of it less as a firm railroad and more like a fluffy concept of the common D&D player's experience. Till next time.